At the Isle of Man TT, the bike with the most freedom to be modified should be the fastest. But the stopwatch proved exactly the opposite. Here, machines born from motorcycles found at dealerships have to face nearly 38 miles, about 61 kilometers, of public roads, with more than 200 corners, jumps, compressions, elevation changes, and sections where speeds approach 200 miles per hour, roughly 320 kilometers per hour. And that's exactly why preparing a bike for the TT doesn't simply mean extracting maximum power. Suspension, tires, aerodynamics, and even the amount of fuel all have to find a balance for a road that demands completely opposite things from the same machine. But how far can a production-derived motorcycle be pushed in this environment? Why can a more extreme setup fail to produce a faster lap? And how did a class closer to street bikes manage to challenge what seemed to be the logic of the Isle of Man TT? To understand that, first we need to understand what happens when a seemingly familiar motorcycle meets a road that changes every rule. At first glance, the motorcycles that take on the Isle of Man TT look familiar. BMW, Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki, Yamaha. And there's a reason for that. The machines in the main classes have their origins in production motorcycles. In Superbike, their models typically derive from street bikes, equipped with engines of around 1,000 cubic centimeters and capable of producing more than 200 brake horsepower. They retain the overall appearance of their production versions, but teams have the freedom to make deeper engine modifications and changes to the chassis. But at the TT, more modifications don't necessarily mean more speed. And here's an important distinction. Superstock bikes also start with production sport motorcycles, just like superbikes. The difference is how much they can be modified. While a superbike allows deeper engine tuning and chassis modifications, superstock regulations are far more restrictive, specifically to keep these machines close to what the public can buy at a dealership. Limited modifications are allowed for safety reasons, but the engine, frame, and electronics remain essentially stock. In other words, the two may start from a similar foundation, but they take very different paths once they enter a race team's workshop. And that leads to an almost inevitable conclusion. If a team can modify more components and extract more performance, the more heavily prepared machine should dominate the stopwatch. It should, because there's one detail capable of tearing that logic apart. At the TT, the motorcycle isn't facing a conventional racetrack. It's facing the mountain course, and that completely changes the rules of the game. It's 37.73 miles, about 60.7 kilometers, through a sequence of public roads, closed for competition. The lap begins in Douglas, cuts through towns and villages, charges through rural sections, and climbs into the mountains before returning to the capital. Along the way, there are more than 200 corners, with constant changes in elevation and road characteristics, and a few specific sections help reveal the scale of the challenge. At Balao Bridge, riders actually leave the pavement and launch over the bridge. At Barragero, the problem is almost completely reversed, with a brutal compression on the descent. And then there are sections like Solby Strait, where the bikes can approach 200 miles per hour, roughly 320 kilometers per hour. All of this happens within the same lap. And perhaps the most impressive number isn't the top speed. In good conditions, this entire course can be completed in just 17 to 20 minutes, at average speeds between 110 and 130 miles per hour, roughly 177 to 209 kilometers per hour. That means the bike has to charge through corners, undulations, jumps, and constantly changing road characteristics without losing its rhythm. But weather, grip, and course conditions can still completely transform that balance. This is where the TT's true contradiction emerges. The most powerful or most heavily modified bike doesn't necessarily have the perfect solution. The TT doesn't demand that a motorcycle do one single thing exceptionally well. It demands that it survive completely different problems, lap after lap, without ever stopping being fast. And there's one component where practically all of those problems eventually come together. It has to cope with the bike being slammed into the pavement under compression one moment, and, shortly afterward, with the wheels literally leaving the ground. So how do you set up suspension for a road that demands two seemingly opposite things from the same motorcycle? To understand the scale of the problem, it's worth comparing these machines with what exists at the other extreme of motorcycle racing, a MotoGP bike. There, practically everything is built to race. These are pure prototypes, built exclusively for competition, with 1,000 cubic centimeter engines, approximately 250 horsepower, carbon front brakes, seamless gearboxes, and technologies developed specifically to extract performance on racetracks. There's no requirement to start with a motorcycle that someone could buy at a dealership, and that makes the TT almost an inversion of that philosophy. Here, many of the bikes start much closer to production models, but they're forced to face an environment that a conventional street bike simply wasn't designed for. And the difference isn't just speed. A MotoGP bike is optimized for a permanent racetrack. On the mountain course, a single setup has to work across nearly 38 miles, about 61 kilometers, of public roads, dealing with uneven surfaces, patched asphalt, elevation changes, and road characteristics that constantly transform throughout the course. That doesn't mean MotoGP is less demanding. It means MotoGP allows specialization. The TT demands compromise. And perhaps no component demonstrates that better than the suspension. On a permanent racetrack, MotoGP teams also adjust suspension, chassis, engine braking, and electronics to find the ideal setup for each track. At the TT, however, the setup has to handle irregularities and elevation changes scattered throughout the entire mountain course. The suspension has to keep the tire tracking an imperfect road at high speed, control weight transfer under braking, withstand compressions, and still cope with moments when the motorcycle leaves the ground. An excessively stiff setup can compromise the wheel's ability to follow the irregularities. An excessively soft setup has to cope with massive load transfers and suspension travel. There is no perfect setup for every section. There is one setup that has to survive all of them. But suspension is only the beginning, because there's another problem that silently grows as speed increases: the air itself. In production-based classes, components like the windscreen and fuel tank normally remain close to the original parts. At the TT, the demands are so specific that the regulations allow exceptions. According to the event's technical director, the sustained speeds require larger windscreens to provide greater wind protection. In other words, here, aerodynamics isn't just about making the motorcycle fast. It also has to keep that speed from physically wearing down the rider sitting on top of it. And the same logic extends to the fuel tank. The regulations allow larger tanks because the bikes need to be capable of completing 2 laps of the mountain course. That's approximately 75.46 miles, more than 121 kilometers, before returning to refuel. That means carrying enough fuel for a distance that would be absurd within the logic of a short circuit race. And there's an inevitable consequence. As the fuel is burned, the mass being carried changes as well. The machine has to remain predictable, even as its weight and behavior transform throughout the laps. Then we get to the tires. And here another detail emerges that helps explain why road racing is a completely different world. Metzeler says its Racetech RR tires were developed from experience in races held not on racetracks, but on roads used by the public throughout the rest of the year. According to the manufacturer, that's precisely why road racing exposes tires to a variety of situations found on real-world roads and serves as a development ground. In Superstock, the demand can be even easier to visualize. In the 3-lap format described by the TT, the same rear tire has to endure 113 miles, about 182 kilometers, of racing without being replaced. That's the same tire being hammered by acceleration, braking, heat, and constantly changing surfaces. The tire that starts the race has to keep working dozens of minutes later because there's no room to treat it like a disposable component every few miles. And there's a story that shows just how completely small differences can transform a motorcycle on these roads. Rider Dom Herbertson said that he made his TT debut on a Yamaha R6 with a completely stock front end, and described the motorcycle as violent and unable to hold a straight line. After receiving guidance and switching to Metzeler tires, he said the bike became stable, and his average speed jumped from 105 to 118 miles per hour, roughly 169 to 190 kilometers per hour, allowing him to qualify. It's not a controlled scientific test, but it's a brutal account of how, on the mountain course, balance can matter just as much as power. And that brings us to a strange conclusion. A MotoGP bike is one of the most sophisticated motorcycles ever created, a prototype that exists exclusively to race. But a TT bike faces a different kind of problem, making a production-derived machine work in an environment that constantly changes across dozens of miles without being optimized for just one situation. Suspension, fuel, aerodynamics, tires, electronics, and rider all have to survive the same compromise. And this is exactly where all that engineering produces a contradiction that's hard to ignore. After everything we've seen, it would be natural to imagine that the absolute limit of the mountain course would belong to the machine with the greatest freedom for modification. A heavily modified superbike, built to extract every last fraction of performance possible. But the stopwatch tells a different story, because the fastest lap ever recorded at the Isle of Man TT wasn't set by a superbike. It was set by a motorcycle from a class much closer to the production models these machines originated from. And when we put that lap time into perspective, the result seems almost absurd. So what motorcycle managed to do it? And just how fast do you have to charge through nearly 38 miles of public roads to set the outright Isle of Man TT record? The answer came in 2023. Peter Hickman covered the 37.73 miles of the Isle of Man TT in 16 minutes and 36.115 seconds. His average speed across the entire lap was 136.358 miles per hour, approximately 219 kilometers per hour. Not on a straight, not for a few seconds. That was the average required to complete nearly 38 miles of public roads. And the motorcycle used to set that lap was a BMW M 1000RR. But here's the detail that makes the record even more extraordinary. It wasn't a superbike, it was a superstock, the very class that keeps the engine, frame, and electronics much closer to the production motorcycle. The machine with less freedom for modifications managed to beat the more heavily prepared superbikes and set the fastest outright lap in TT history. The expectation built from the very beginning gets completely reversed. That day, more modifications didn't necessarily mean more speed, and an average of 136 miles per hour is still a difficult number to comprehend. So imagine covering exactly the same route in a regular car. Let's eliminate traffic, stoplights, stops, and any delays, and assume a constant average speed of 40 miles per hour, roughly 64 kilometers per hour, across all 37.73 miles. Even in this practically perfect hypothetical scenario, the trip would take approximately 56 minutes and 36 seconds. Hickman needed 16 minutes and 36. That means he completed the course about 3.4 times faster. By the time the car finally finished one lap, Hickman could have covered that same distance more than 3 times. And perhaps that's the number that best explains these motorcycles. The record wasn't created by more than 200 horsepower alone. It was created because the tires, suspension, aerodynamics, fuel, chassis, and rider managed to work together while the road demanded different things from the machine at every moment. Thousands of compromises transformed into a single lap, because the true achievement of these motorcycles isn't simply getting close to 200 miles per hour, roughly 320 kilometers per hour. It's doing that on a production-derived machine, charging through nearly 38 miles of public roads, and remaining precise enough to finish with an average speed above 136 miles per hour. They weren't prepared just to be fast. They were prepared to survive. Now tell me this, if you could choose one of them to take on a single lap of the Isle of Man TT, would you go with a superbike or a superstock? And why? If this video kept you hooked all the way to this point, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to keep exploring stories of extreme challenges, impossible races, and people who push beyond the limit. And look, there's another video appearing on the screen right now. Click it, and I'll see you over there. Keep exploring. The world doesn't stop, and neither do we.